7 years ago, this past spring, a guy named James Costello went to the Boston Marathon to stand at the finish line to cheer on one of his friends who was running. He was, as we like to say, in the wrong place at the wrong time. A bomb exploded. He burned his arms and legs. Projectiles tore through his chest and his body. And what followed was months of hospitalization, surgery, and rehabilitation. But one positive thing happened through that experience. James fell in love with one of his caregivers, a nurse named Krista. And he asked her to marry him. And she said yes. He wrote on his Facebook page, "I now understand the reason that this happened to me," he wrote. "It was to meet the love of my life and the woman of my dreams." Well, that's a great story. But I wonder, how do you find meaning in your life? For a lot of people of faith, they find their meaning in a loving and providential God. And others, on the other end of the spectrum, see life as an evolutionary process to propagate one's species and continue one's genes. But James saw things differently. He believed that what happened to him was for a reason. That's not uncommon. We live through a catastrophic event, like a terrorist attack, and we try to find meaning there. Or we're diagnosed with cancer, and we're cured. And we look back and say, this must have happened for a reason. Some time ago, Yale University asked a number of people to reflect back on significant events in their lives, the birth of their children, the deaths of people they loved, their weddings, graduations, illnesses, and they asked them how they found meaning. Now again, for people of faith, they saw that these events and what transpired happened because of a design, a purpose, a meaning. Now, not surprisingly, perhaps, people who didn't believe in God felt the same way, just without the God factor. They believed that whether you called it fate, or a meaningful universe, or a purposeful life, everything happens for a reason. So it's true then, everything happens for a reason. Oprah said it. A lot of preachers, psychologists, and self-help gurus have often said it. I have to confess, along with another platitude that goes, when God closes a door, he opens a window. I have to confess that everything happens for a reason is one of my least favorite sayings. I think it's bad theology, bad philosophy, bad advice, a bad way to look at life. But I can understand why we desire to do so. 31 years ago, I was diagnosed with cancer. Now, it's easier to think that these kind of things happen to us because of a reason rather than just dumb luck and a bad roll of the genetic dice. And that kind of brings us to a scripture. It comes from St. Paul's letter to the Romans, and he says, "All things work together for good for those who love God and are called according to his purposes." Well, does that resonate with your life experience? When you had that miscarriage, was that for good? When your spouse walked out on you and the kids, was that for good? When your dad was diagnosed with COVID and died alone in a nursing home without you holding his hand, was that God's good purposes? Now, some people will moderate those words and try to say, well, everything does have a purpose. Just look, for those who love God, says St. Paul. So is that the key? We just aren't loving God enough if bad things happen to us? And who are called according to his purposes. Who knows what God's purposes are? I think the key to that sentence is found in a footnote. It's found in many study Bibles. Down at the bottom, there's a little asterisk that says, some of the oldest manuscripts say, in everything, God is working for good. That, I think, is a really good way to look at not just the scripture, but what happens to us in our lives. Many years ago, the New York Times carried the story of a woman named Marie Balter. Marie, at the age of 17, suffered from anxiety, but she was misdiagnosed as schizophrenic and committed to a state mental hospital, Danvers State Mental Hospital in Massachusetts. And there, Marie languished for 17 years under the wrong diagnosis. With the help of her friends and with the strength of her will and her faith, Marie eventually won her release. She went home to make a life, got an apartment, fell in love, got married, went to school, earned her bachelor's degree, and then she went to Harvard and earned a degree in public policy and administration. And then at the age of 58, Marie again walked through the halls of Danvers State Mental Hospital, but this time she was the administrator. We love those kind of stories. Does everything happen for a reason? Well, I think I would say that although there is wide margin for us to act in our lives, we don't always know why things happen to us, but we can determine how we respond to what happened to us. There's not always a purpose, but there's always a presence. 3,000 years ago, a poet said, "Where can I go from your spirit? And how can I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in hell, you are there." Whatever happens to you, whatever happens to me, whatever tragedies or wonderful things behold us in this life are not determined ahead of time. Everything doesn't happen for a reason, but we can find meaning and purpose. In our darkest night, in our darkest hour, when we confront our greatest fears, it's good for you and me to remember that we are not alone.